Now, around and about the green, I realised I'd set myself rather an ambitious talk title, and it's the usual story. Once you get into it, it's what to leave out rather than what to include. And also, people in the previous 12 years, as Terry indicated, have spoken about one or two of the topics in detail. So I will allude to those, but I won't dwell too much on those where we've covered things before. And I've already noticed in the new schedule coming up this year that somebody's going to talk about a couple of the people I'm going to mention this evening. So that's a sort of a trailer. You'll have to come back in October to hear a bit more detail on that. So anyway, we'll set to rather ambitious this evening. So I'm hoping that we'll crack on and won't keep you too late tonight. Now, the first challenge is moving on to the next slide. Well, about that. I've thought a lot about that. Around and about the green. There are currently about 25 properties which have the address of the green at the moment. Now, of course, that hasn't always been the case over the years, because it hasn't always been called the green. And indeed, houses didn't have addresses. They might have had names, but it's probably only in the recent 100 years or so that we've actually had numbers and things like that allocated. So there's going to be too many to talk about individually. So I've focused on those, as I've called it, a little bit more interesting, and have been occupied at the time by some interesting character. First, a little background about the green itself. And it's not uncommon in English villages that once you set up a church building, a market might have grown up outside. It was a good spot from the marketing point of view to catch the attention of churchgoers, etc. And Albourne was granted a market and a charter right back in the 1300s. And that in turn established dwellings nearby. I'm tempted to say actually on the green, because there has been a hint that could have been buildings on the green, but we'll mention that again a bit later on. Anyway, the market did persist for several hundred years, but then faded away in the 1600s. The dwellings that were around the green were severely damaged. For those of you who don't know, Albourne suffered two great fires, 1760, 1777. And consequently, a lot of the property you see there now were built or rebuilt in the late 1700s, in other words, and the early 1800s. So it's perhaps not the original, but maybe the sites are the same, but the structures are more substantial. And of course, that was probably one of the last times where there were thatched buildings around there, because they were prone to catch fire rather easily. And also people wanted to update some modern roofs, I suppose. Images of the green. Well, obviously in early times, we haven't got any, but this one is fairly famous, quite well known. You've probably seen it before. The painting by John Buckler, 1806. Now, there's a bit of interesting detail on here, because our cross, the sloping cross, I'll mention that a little bit later, is there. Alongside it, those funny little things. Now, I'm told I might actually be able to get a pointer on. Oh, look at that. The wonders of modern science. Evidence of some stocks. Now, lots of times in recent times when we should bring back the stocks for errant social hooligans around the village and others. But there were certainly stocks there in the 1806. But what is missing is this bit here. We're so used to seeing number 15 on the green, the little cottage there at the foot of the church. Now, was it there before then? Was it suddenly built after that time? Or was it a bit of artistic license just to drop that out and make it look a nice picture? We're not really sure. 1807, so just a year on, Abraham Dimmock, who was a local surveyor, drew a map of the village to help with a plan for an alteration of a road. In fact, the road was way down here. They were going to alter the route of Farm Lane. Never actually took place in the end. But anyway, our focus is a little bit more up towards the green. But it's quite difficult to see there. So if we just move on a slide, This is a bit more detail. I apologise, the quality of the picture isn't so good because I've had to zoom in so many times just to highlight the green. But you'll see key features there, the church, of course, and the boar, as in blue, not the boar as a stream or anything like that. No, the blue boar. And the name of somebody, Perfect, who owned a bit of property there. And the main centre point, of course, is that the green was then called Hightown. And that name has flip-flopped around between being the actual green area and also these days, more specifically, the name of one of the properties nearby the green. But quite often the early documents, particularly property sales and things like that, refer to Hightown. And in addition, there were some extra roads that we don't mention much these days. The road leading up from the Crown up this way was often referred to as Church Street. And the one leading off the top here, Brook Corner, was North Street. And we have a West Street and a South Street. So there was some evidence of it being a sort of grid system historically. Slightly better map. We move on a couple of years because the enclosure of the village took place in 1809-ish, and a much more detailed map. Many of you will have seen this one in the Heritage Centre. It's a beautiful map, and John has annotated it in the Heritage Centre, so you can actually relate all the houses and bits of land to individual owners and occupiers at that time. Don't want to go down that particular route this evening, but there is your North Street up the top here, Hightown in the green, and over here is Back Lane. That also at times have been called Church Lane because we've got some sales of property down there which refer to it as Church Lane. So it's all a bit of a mishmash of exactly where we are. But you identify obviously the cross in the middle. And you can see the buildings around there, this is 1809, pretty much the same as they are today. And in particular, the fact there's a bit of a gap here. This is where Malcolm Fletcher's house is, sort of set back. So there's a little bit of gap in the sequence. But other than that, the cottages right up to the church steps and Phil's cottage on the corner there and all the ones down here. And although it's not easy to read, it does say the boar there, blue boar, and this open area down here, which is we'll come on to a bit later on. A rather nice painting by George Matton. He was a painter based in Marlborough, but he did stray out from time to time. And this is quite a well-known painting. I do believe the original exists in the village somewhere these days. But it's a beautiful, detailed picture. He painted in a sort of a Lowry style in a way, not exactly stick figures, but very simple. And you can identify yet again, this is the blue boar over here, right next to it, what looks like Vine Cottage as it's called these days, probably Wall Cottage here, and obviously on this side, the row of cottages which we'll be talking about. A note in particular, a cow on the green. Slightly different version, not a very good quality picture. Spot the differences. Two cows. This is known as the two-cow version. And also the people themselves, and little dogs and things, mysteriously appear and disappear. And over here, yes, we've got the blue boar. There's a bit of a gap on that property there. I'll try and do a spot the difference side by side. You can only guess that maybe the one on the left, the monochrome type 1, was a preliminary drawing, perhaps by Matton, went back to his studio and decided to paint it and simplify it, take one of the cows away. But then why suddenly add in quite a substantial building? So I'm going to leave it hanging in the air that we're not really sure which sequence these come in, but do remember there's a two-cow version and a one-cow version.
The one on the left doesn't show the pathway down from the corner.
Yes, yeah. Well, it's sort of there, as I say. There's lots of little detail. If you start to look at it, it's quite interesting. And I bow to people like Joe Hutchins and I think Jenny, who can spot a lot more differences than I can here. I mean, if you look at that one over there, you can probably still see some stops just at the base of the cross. Was this one? No sign of them there. So again, a bit of artistic license. We must press on. Once the camera came along, we're on much more solid ground. This is a photograph, obviously, from the church tower. I can only say, let's say, about World War One period. The reason being, in particular, is over here, the thatched row of buildings, which were probably stables, adjoining onto the Blue Boar in this sort of area here. The green itself looks a bit battered. And also notice at that time, not only in addition to the cross, but there's also this other pole here, which had a gas, well, probably an oil lamp originally, may have become a gas lamp on the centre of the green. That was there for a good long time. And in fact, a really ornate lamp was bought by the surrounding properties and installed in the 1890s. There was already a pole there, but they put a really nice lamp in at that time. So they had a whip round and bought a nice light. Another thing to mention, in particular there, is that the big tree is missing. I've jumped on inadvertently jumped on a slide. Apart from that, everything looks remarkably similar. You've got pretty much all the slaty houses, but still a like Dawn Cottage down here, one of the few thatched cottages in that area. If we jump on, this is about after the First World War, probably about 1925. And those of you who've listened to Terry's talk about racing stables, you will know that by that time, there'd been a disastrous fire. Here we've got the thatched, whoops, it's gone crazy. That's my fault, I do apologise. And here we've got a more select arrangement of stables. And in particular, you can see these horse boxes over there. That's because Hightown had been taken over by Major Powell at about 1923-24, and he rebuilt the stables that were destroyed in one of the fires, mentioned again in a moment. And that pretty much remained the case in that sort of area right through to the 1950s. So very similar, but slightly different in that the stables have varied. Nice picture here, round about First World War, judging by the kids' clothes. Hard to sort of pin it down otherwise, but so nice to see another cow wandering around the green. Probably not the same one that Matton had painted some 70 or 80 years before, but a very casual thing. In fact, that there seems to be more cattle here as well. So it was a bit of free for all. Obviously, the children probably went home a bit mucky after playing on the green, I can imagine. But a really nice photo would surely does deserve a wider audience in some ways. A little bit later on, the green, obviously still an area for the children to play. And now, maybe 1930s, 40s, a bit hard to tell. But you've still got this lamp on the green. Quite a nice lamp there. And another pole, in fact, there's two there, with a little tiny lamp sticking out of it. Not quite sure why you would have two lamps. Oops, I do apologise. Other than that, as we know, not a lot of change over the last 80 or 90 years in that area. Look at a little bit more detail about who lived around and about the green. 1881 census, there were about 21 properties listed on the census called the green. There were a couple extra ones called near the green. I discounted those, and other ones near the pond, which didn't really help much, but there were certainly 21. And 94 people living in those properties. Anything from just one person in one of the households up to 10 people. I know some of the houses had servants as well, and they counted in the census, of course. Now, I roughly guessed about 40 people these days in 25 houses. So the density of population has changed. Little small cottages have been condensed into single buildings now. Interesting perhaps to have a quick look. What did they all do, all these people? Cabinet makers, carpenters, dressmakers, labourers, agricultural labourers, that is. School children, of course, they're quite big families. There was a shepherd listed and a blacksmith, seamstress, a willow manufacturer. They didn't make the willow, but they used the willow to make things. And there was a female saddler. Now, there are not many of those around these days, let alone then, but because it's quite tough work. Probably the nearest you get is the lady on the repair shop. Yeah, repair shop, isn't it? Who works with leather? Yeah, so there's certainly a precedent in Albourne. A couple of farmers, a maltster, organist, chairmaker, pork butcher, very specific. But then, of course, people had a lot of pigs around. Woodman, shoemaker, and an annuitant, i.e. a pensioner, somebody who had an annuity. So that was the beginning of the, so I dare use the word gentrification of the green in a way. People were moving in. It's a gathering place, still is, has been for a long time. 1829. Now that was about the time the Methodists were showing their colours in the village. The primitive Methodists came along, the preachers came along. About a good crowd, I'd estimate, this is a newspaper report, about 400 people. They had a lot of heckling from the, shall we call it, Church of England, for want of a better word. And the parish clerk was there with a handbell trying to drown out the preachers. So I don't know who actually won in the end, but the fact that the Methodists are still very much in strength in the village, as we can see today. 1888, as a report of Harvest Festival. Now, Harvest Festivals were big events in the past, not so obvious these days, big events, and there was preaching and the band playing on the green. And that was, as I say, repeated many times. 1890s, particularly late 1880s, 1890s, it was a downturn in the agricultural area here, and the workers were up in arms, shall we say. The labourers were trying to get a representation against the landlords or the landowners. And a fair crowd heard a unionist meeting, unionists being roughly equivalent to Conservatives, I suppose, to hear one of the speakers, one of the candidates for being an MP. It was a few years later when the Liberals eventually got in, and that was it weren't, of course, the Labour Party in those days. This area favoured liberalism from the agricultural workers as some sort of change. 1913, the Women's Local Government Society, catchy little title, and 500 women gathered on the green to support the movement to get the women more involved in the local councils. At that time, of course, they generally hadn't got a vote even in the general elections, let alone any local activity. But there was obviously a strong feeling that they should be involved, which was very good. Something a bit more light-hearted on the green, folk dance demonstration. Morris dancing, country dancing, sword dancing. And it was so busy, they had extra displays put on at the old rectory as well. A very popular time. 1941, sadly, during the wartime, we had to be prepared. So there were voluntary groups in the village, and we had the firefighting display. Didn't quite go according to plan because the incendiary bombs they used failed to light. They did have to light them afterwards, artificially. By then, it records that most of the crowd had drifted away. So the point of the demonstration was rather lost. Yeah. Jumping back, photographs, big gathering. Hard to tell here. Could have been Queen Victoria's Jubilee.
Edward's coronation.
Or Edward's coronation. I mean, if John's fairly sure now that it's Edward's coronation. So we just drift into, what's that, 1902, the coronation. Yeah. But you can tell from the dress, again, around about that time, one or two banners showing. I think on the proper print, you can actually read some of those words. It's not so obviously on the reproduction here. And possibly the same event or similar event. And again, judging by the dress, real Edwardian style. And lots of banners and lots of parades going on. Some hint of a bit of music being played, I think, there, possibly in this area here. And so a general good time, much the same as we have today. We're right up to date, following the interest in the US 101st Airborne, who were based in the village in the wartime for training, and in particular the Band of Brothers. There have been several meetings where people rolled out the old military vehicles. There was one in 2004, but this one is on my own photograph from 2006. So again, the green is gathering, but perhaps for different reasons. A horrible day. All the pictures I took that day show it to be incredibly wet, unfortunately. Can anyone remember this? Yep, this is the filming for those who are new to the village, of course. There's always somebody new. This was set up as an ice rink for the filming of the Vodafone 2018 Christmas advertisement on television. And this was done tail end of September into the first part of October. And when it was finished, it created quite a sort of atmospheric, semi-Victorian-y type atmosphere. But that was the setup. Most of the filming was done at night. So I wasn't able to get a decent photograph. Maybe somebody here has got some good photographs taken at the time. I'm sure the Heritage would love to have them to add to their collection. But they put a lot of effort into creating this ice rink outside. Fingers crossed, technical fingers crossed, I might be able to show the video later this evening. Don't go away. Better start looking at individual houses around the green. We've got to crack on. So right down these days, what is now number 1A, 1B, right down at the bottom. But until this early part of this century, we can say now it was just one property, and it's been split into two. But it has origins right back to the 1700s, probably remodeled in the 1800s, as so many of the cottages and houses were after the fires. 1897, it was a shop listed as being run by Rachel Goldsmith. But it's mainly known for the link to the Lydiard family. They run the corn store. Here I can see people nodding now, those of an age who can remember it. But they sold a wide variety of haberdashery, toys, pet supplies, etc., DIY and ironmongery. And to help them along, Harry Lydiard had a dog, Rover, and he became quite famous for the money he collected on behalf of the hospital every year and other good causes. Ultimately, the premises were sold as a shop back in 1974. But just to remind you about our famous dog who raised money, raised £20 there for Savernake Hospital, roughly £500 at today's values. And it's got a nice little memorial, if you haven't seen it, down by the pond, just by the parish notice board. So look carefully, and it's got a lovely, lovely little plaque there. 1A and 1B, the green. What's that got to do with cookery? Well, about 1978, the property was in the hands of Myra Street, and she opened it as a restaurant called Dufton's. And if you know Wendy Beattie in the village, Tim Beattie's wife, she worked there as a schoolgirl, helping out at weekends for Myra Street. And Myra wrote quite a lot of cookery books, but they were mainly Marks and Spencer's ones. So you probably recognise the style there. I've certainly got one, was possibly by her at home. This particular example includes 92 casserole-style recipes, using the old way of doing it, from American chicken to veal casserole. And it wouldn't be the same without your favourite tripe and onions. Don't see that in many cookery books, but good hearty stuff, as you can tell, looking at the cover of the book, with a pint of ale as well. Changed hands in 1980, early 80s, to Jim and Mary Hannon, and they reopened it, slightly different name, as Raffles. And quite a high quality, because Jim had trained in London. And I understand, and indeed experienced, it had a very good reputation. It was well up in the top 500 restaurants. And Wendy Beatty got a job there as well, still as a youngster. So helping out at weekends. She did comment that they weren't the easiest people to work for. It wasn't so much Jim and Mary, but they had a front of the house chap called Richard, I believe. And he was quite a bit of a tartar for the youngsters, I guess. Sadly, it closed in about 2005. Diletta and I had just come to the village, and we had a few meals there in 2003, but sadly it closed down thereafter, and that's when it was split into two properties. If we just, that's a view of Raffles, a little bit more colourful, actually taken from a placemat, belongs to Terry here, and put to good use.
Are you mentioning Heasman's?
What about this? 1997, it featured in a TV comedy series. It had a bit of a makeover, but the series was called The Last Salute. In the old days, when the AA patrolman would have saluted AA members as they toddled around the countryside, some of us might remember that. And it actually ran for two series. It wasn't wildly successful. You can probably find it tucked away on some YouTube somewhere these days. However, slightly more important, when the makeover was finished, it was called Heasman's. We could argue about whether it should have an apostrophe, the Heasman's bit, but anyway. Yeah, it became the hardware store and featured briefly, very briefly, blink and you miss it sort of situation, in the Last Salute comedy series. And it may be lurking around, as I say, somewhere on YouTube. We move on. Clearly, 3 and 4 was called is called Jasmine Cottage, was called Holly Cottage. Virtually every property around the green is listed by English Heritage and was done as an exercise back in 1966. That's the sort of description you get. Pretty boring. I'm not going to go through all the properties and explain all about their structure in that way. But if you are interested in that, you can look it all up on the English Heritage website. But in recent years, that's now become, as we hinted at earlier, just one property, although you can see evidence there of at least 2, possibly 3 doorways. So they almost certainly would have been 3 substantial cottages, all with quite large families. Now we're down to probably just a couple of people living in that big property. It always seems to impress the Americans when we show them around the village. But one interesting feature not mentioned in the description of English Heritage is the Flemish bond brickwork, which is rather nice. This is where you lay one brick in the traditional way, and then you turn that fix round a little bit, and you have the small end pointing towards you, possibly in a different colour, and you can get some nice patterns on the buildings. So it just makes them look a little bit more interesting, a little bit more stylish. Headers and stretchers, as they're called. Bell Court. It's probably its main fame, clearly, as it was one of the sites, particularly by the Wells family, for casting bells. It looks deceptively small, even these days, but of course, like many of these properties, they had very long gardens at the back, and that's where the bell foundry was. It ran right through until the Wells family went bankrupt around 1825. And that really was the end of the golden age, perhaps, of bell casting in the village. But it gave a degree of fame subsequently. In 1938, Gerald Brennan and his wife Gamel Woolsey, fugitives in that sense from the Spanish Civil War, they supported the wrong side, or at least not Franco's side, and they had to leave Spain, and they came to live there. Now, Gerald had lived in a very remote area in the Granada Mountains since the 1920s. He'd fought in the First World War, and he wanted to get well away from that sort of scenario and read his 2,000 books that he took with him to Spain. And he settled in a very remote village on the slopes of the mountains near Granada. But they were both part of the Bloomsbury set, and they were visited in Spain and subsequently in Albourne by quite important members, Virginia Woolf, people like that they knew extremely well. Dylan Thomas came and stayed with them for a week in Bell Cottage. That's another claim to fame. I say stayed with them. He actually spent most of the time in the pubs around the village. As you know, he liked to drink or three, and Gerald said that he would often be up waiting outside for the Crown to open. So another claim to fame. But his main he wrote a lot about Spain and its cultural history. One of his most revered books, The Spanish Labyrinth, background to the Spanish Civil War, was actually written at Bell Court around about 1943-44. It deserves a plaque outside, but we haven't got plaques much in the village these days. Gerald and Wolsey, they went back to Malaga after things settled down a little bit, and he carried on writing. And his writings are very well respected in Spain even today. And there's a Gerald Brennan Cultural Institute. There's a separate secondary school. That's a photograph of the school that's named after him. Several streets are named after him. So he's a well-respected person, particularly near Malaga. And there's even a chemist's, the Brennan Pharmacia. So not many people who've lived in the village have got a chemist named after them, I don't think. He died, Gamble died in 1968. Gerald died a bit later on. He did donate his body to science, but he was so much revered that they didn't have the determination to cut him up and study him. So in the end, he was buried alongside Gamble in the English cemetery in Malaga. Several people here, maybe not here tonight, but I've certainly visited, and later we visited the English cemetery, which is fascinating in its own right, but particularly so because two residents of Albourne are buried there. And they feature now, as you can see there, on tours. Moving up a little bit to number 8, Mayfield, where Malcolm Fletcher lives. Now, Malcolm gave quite a good talk, extensive talk about Mayfield some years ago, so I'm not going to go over too much of that in detail. But it's important to say that apparently it was probably one of the houses that seemed to escape complete devastation in 1777, despite having a thatch roof at that time. But it had a narrow squeak in 1900 when it was struck by lightning. And that brought down the chimney into the bedroom where Mrs. Lawrence and her maid were at that time. Roof caught fire, but quite a lot to extinguish, quite a lot of damage done. The Lawrence family were important. They'd lived in the village for quite a long time, and they ran the building and carpentry business. We're very lucky to actually have a photograph from that sort of period. That's Walter Lawrence. I'll mention his name again in a moment. Standing outside what appears to be pretty much a thatched building, and that was regarded as his shop. Now, just behind it, it does look as if this roof is possibly slated. It may even be a gutter running along here. So that was almost certainly around about just after it had been struck and perhaps rebuilt after the lightning strike. But they still had thatch on the front of the shop. And obviously being a photograph, it's got to be of a period. So Mayfield in the background, shop workshop in the foreground, and it appears to have the slated roof. That's Walter again, outside his shop, Walter Senior, because he had a son, also Walter, just to confuse matters. But rather a pretty picture in the nicest way. And we could talk again about some of the things that he did. But Walter Lawrence Jr. was particularly important. He was not only a carpenter carrying on the family trade, but he did gilding and all sorts of things. And he designed a stained glass window that's up in Baden Church. That was a memorial to somebody who died in the First World War. So, a man of many talents. He was very musical as well. He was a church organist for many years. And also, he was an inventor, for want of a better word. And in particular, he's credited with making the carillon, using old Wells handbells. That's the instrument. And you're going to jump to William now. There's always been a debate. I was told off a few years ago when I alluded to the fact it was made by William. Anyway, we shall leave that for the moment, because unfortunately, the notice that goes with it just says W. Lawrence, and they were of a similar age, but certainly Walter was more musical. I can carry down. That particular machine, as I say, is now in the Heritage Centre. It was restored some 4 years ago after being stored in the church tower for a long time. Walter died in 1932. And his elder brother, William, he did start in the village, but by the 1890s, he'd left the village and gone to London, fame and fortune as an architect assistant. Terry will say that he took the carillon with him to London and returned it later on.
Yeah, that's where we got that from.
However, there are newspaper reports that Walter certainly used it in the village at various events, festive events. So it's a bit something that maybe a bit more research is required, to be sure. I'll move on from that contentious point to number 10. Not the Downing Street number 10, but 10 the Green, of course. And we go back to a literary theme here, because one of its 20th century occupants was another author, Anne Duffield. Hands up anyone who's read any books by Anne? No. She wrote 50 books, as well as many short stories and magazines. She lived in the village for quite a long time. But you can see there, probably not the style of reading many of you here would favour these days. She'd travelled extensively in her younger years, especially in overseas and China, and she wrote books, obviously, on a romantic theme. And her husband and her moved to the village initially just up the Marlborough Road, Clock's Cottage. That's the one as you go up there where Paul Googe lives these days, just up the Marlborough Road. Anyway, they moved to the Green subsequently. And she was a very busy author, but she was very active in lots of the local organisations in the village at that time. She was so popular, she featured in a Women's Illustrated in 1957. And there's a nice picture of the inside of the property at that stage. The main stress was on the home's modern features. Wait to be impressed. A water softener. Now that's not bad going for 1957. Maybe it was somebody out the back filtering the water, I don't know, but it was a water softener. Glass panelled internal doors. A stainless steel sink and draining board. A refrigerator and gas cooker, all of the same height. None of your rough stuff here. Built-in cupboards with sliding doors. And a red tiled floor. How's about that? Anne died in 1976, and she'd lived in Norbourne for about 50 years. So it's surprising that she's not better remembered in some respects. And I should have said at this point, I'll reveal later a table over there with several of the books written by Gerald Brennan and also one of those by Anne Duffield. Should anyone wish to borrow it to read, they're more than welcome to see me afterwards. Market House. Well, it does what it says on the tin in a way. It's almost certainly associated with the market, maybe in some administrative role. but maybe just named in later years for sort of nostalgic reasons, the fact that there was a market around. But probably the first reason is probably most likely to be the case. 1930s was quite important because the Eve family, Beatrice Emma and Beatrice Wright Eve, lived there. Beatrice Emma died 1945, Emma Eve lived on. It was Beatrice that died. It's very confusing, these names, but stayed on living there till 1956. And when she did leave, she kindly conveyed the house to the church as a vicarage. A generous move, probably not the sort of thing you hear much of these days. In 1975, the church sold it on privately to Daphne and John Lott. That's Jenny Quadrat's mother and father, I should add, for those who may not know. Jenny, who lives just further up the green, we're coming to her in a moment. And they used those funds to build what is considered to be the current vicarage. Chantry Cottage comes, as it says there, from singing of mass or chapel singer, French Latin words, and it involved in medieval times for priests to sing prayers for the dead. And as you could in those days, if you had lots of money, you could pay someone to say prayers on your behalf. Save a bit of bother going to church when you're such a busy farmer or whatever. It can actually refer to the place of worship or somebody connected to the church singing. So it seems very likely that's the cottage where the chantry priest may well have dwelt at one time. And in the church, if you've not been there for a little bit, there's a very nice brass representation on the chancel floor about Henry Freckleton. He was the chantry chaplain in about 1508. So it's a good long history on that. Jump on to 14 Horner Cottage. Jenny was kind to show me a week or so back. They've got documents right back to 1664, which is fantastic. An indenture, a sort of document allowing the property to be sold or otherwise rented between those two gentlemen. And it changed hands a few years later for £50, roughly equivalent to £7,000 at today's values. 76 years later, changed hands again, still £50. So the property wasn't rising in value as quite as much as it is these days. But there have been so many changes, I mean, you could do a whole talk just about that cottage alone. But it's only in the last 50 years or so that the cottage has merged, because that part there with the blue door was originally Corner Cottage, and this part here was number 13. Now the two have been merged, so it now makes one property, and hence why the appearance of two doors, which were two separate main entrances at one time. Again, good evidence of how things have changed around and about the green. As most distinguished occupant, another been forgotten about a little bit, Thomas Fairchild. Now, Jan Lambourne at the back there had a very nice talk a few years back in great detail. So again, I won't go into too much here, but for the newer people to the village, Thomas Fairchild was a lovely painting. He lived there. He was baptised in St Michael's in June 1667, i.e. he was born around that time. His father was a farmer. And the Fairchild name appears on the documents which Jenny has. And Thomas probably went to a sort of school, because there used to be a room over the porch in the church, which acted as a little school, very small. The floor of that's been removed now, so you've got a much higher entrance as you go into the West Church, and sorry, not south door of the church. But when he was 15, he was farmed off to London for apprenticeship to a cloth maker. Remember, this was about the time that fustian cloth, etc., was quite a popular thing in the village. Anyway, he got farmed off to London, but he didn't like working indoors, and so he took up a bit of gardening. He did complete his cloth maker's apprenticeship, but he also became a full-time gardener in Hoxton, which is part of Hackney. Now, gardening was extremely popular in London at that time, despite the very gloomy atmosphere, very smoky. Wouldn't think it would be ideal for growing exotic plants, but strange things were being imported by people travelling abroad. And also the existence of male and female organs in plants had just been discussed. And Thomas realised that there was some practical application. So he managed to merge a sweet william with a carnation to produce a plant which was colloquially known as Fairchild's mule. Lots of other rivals were quite disparaging about his efforts, so that's probably why they got that as a name. But that, of course, was the first man-made hybrid in Europe, heralded thousands of varieties that you get these days. And he actually is regarded as the forgotten father of the flower garden. And he lived in Holborn. And he wrote that little booklet at the side there, The City Gardener, was written in 1722. Sorry, there we are. And then he died a few years later. The biography, in particular, by, sorry, Michael Heasman. But have a swig of water, I think. It is water.
You say.
Yes, the biography is a great read if you're a gardener of any interest at all. It really is a very well and very interesting book. There's a copy on the table. You'll be able to see it. But he's not actually completely forgotten, because there's quite a substantial school in London. Thomas Fairchild Community School in Hackney. So another person who's had a school named after him, Gerald Brennan and Thomas Fairchild. And he also left money. He was relatively rich by the time he died, and he left some money for an annual sermon praising creation and horticulture. It's nicknamed the Vegetable Sermon. It was held for several hundred years, and it elapsed, but then it was revived. I still don't know if it's running today. Couldn't find that, couldn't be sure. I've called this the firehouse, for want of a better word, because that's where Adam and Eve, the fire engines that protected the village for many years, were housed. Now, they didn't have nice doors like that in it at that time, because if we look at a sort of period photograph with Adam and Eve outside, I'm guessing late 1800s, early 1900s perhaps, there's Adam and Eve. Eve's sadly the smaller machine, Adam is the larger machine. And a tiny, tiny door perhaps to actually put these machines through. You know, it's just about enough, I suppose, but it looks almost inadequate at that time. And it just says over the door, fire engines. That's what it was called in those days. 1940s, Adam and Eve had been retired in 1923 or thereabouts. They got a motorised fire engine. And in the wartime, of course, there were volunteers. So a smart-looking lot on the left was obviously the regular fire brigade, all dressed in their best outfit at that stage, all volunteers, of course, from around the village. Nobody was paid. And then the ladies, they were also represented. Obviously didn't have a whip round for some much smarter clothes, but obviously it was very serviceable. And the vehicle in the background has obviously been adapted. You can see pump house outlets there. Looks like a normal sort of sedan type car that's been adapted for firefighting if needs be in the wartime. Cracking on, Wall Cottage, lovely looking building, especially on a nice day as that was. It was down as a brew house in the 1600s. So many properties in the village at that time brewed their own ale. So it wasn't unusual, and it's listed as that. Come the enclosure time, it was down as a willow trade base. In the late 1880s, there was a big demand in the village for additional education. By then, many of the youngsters had learned to read and write, not all, but some wanted to progress their education a little bit more. And they wanted a reading room away from the temptations of alcohol. There was a strong temperance movement in the village at that stage in the 1880s, 1890s. So that was somewhere where they could go, learn things, have a smoke away from the pubs. And the room was actually set up in Wall Cottage, 1892, and there they could have gone along and learned a bit about wood carving. Somebody came all the way down from London to teach them as well. If you had a penny a week, you could register, and there was a list of 50 people in no time at all. So it was very popular. A little bit later on, obviously, racehorses from Hightown would pass by. So you can see the building. And obviously off to the left here, this area here, was still the blacksmiths at that time. And if we move on, changed hands many times. One brief owner, can't really claim as fame for the village because not absolutely sure whether he actually lived here, but he certainly owned the property, was Francis Camps. Now, when I was a youngster, I well remember the serial killers, John Christie and Dr. Bodkin Adams. Some people may here remember, certainly John Christie of Rillington Place infamy. And Francis Camps was the pathologist who became very important at that time. And he bought the cottage, 1930. He was still a young doctor. He just qualified, but he sold it a year later. That's because he took up a post in Essex. It was rather a long way to live. But then he sold it on to the Bickham sisters. And it was still, as I say, a blacksmith next to the cottage. September Cottage is there now. Slightly later on, probably, the Bickham sisters, Helen and Hester, they lived there for a good many years. Apparently, they were not very well liked by the children. I've got this from Terry. I'm sure others may remember them. I'm not quite sure. But after World War II, some people may remember, you used to go along and be handed out welfare stamps, orange juice, cod liver oil, or possibly you were booked in to see the community nurse. Nurse Niven operated from there. So perhaps that's why it wasn't very popular with the children at that time. And apparently there was also a shop at that side. I don't know much about that. Terry's
Johnny Claridge had a flower shop.
A flower shop, I'm told. Yeah, somebody. Yeah, little flower shop, one like that. So that's fine. We've added something to that knowledge. And alongside Wall Cottage, more importantly, there's a little shingle track there now. And that leads down to Willow Cottages, number 17, 18 and 18A. Now, a photograph on the left, taken recently, there's been a lot of work going on number 17. Supposed to have been a simple little bit of reconstruction, but it actually seems to have dragged on, so I couldn't get a decent photograph. If you go down on a good day, on the wall, you can quite see clearly these are called Willow Cottages. Quite a distinctive name. And as the name implies, these cottages were very much the centre for willow stripping and weaving. A very important trade in the village for a while. It sort of took over from fustian and bell founding as one of the main sources of income for quite a while. Up to 40 looms were listed, and there were 26 willow weavers in 1851 around and about this area on the green. So it's very significant, important trade for a while. It was good business until, as things happen, fashions changed and those hats went out of demand. But it used to bring in as much as equivalent to £3,000 a week for the village. So it's very prosperous. And it pretty much ceased by the 1880s. However, they didn't waste any of the willows, not just on the bonnets. They used the strands were used for ornamentation in fireplaces and thicker shavings to light the fires. And in 1893, one of the national magazines listed that almost all the stove shavings used by British housewives were made in Albourne. So it's quite a centre for excellence for a while. Quickly mention Vine Cottage. I quite think this is rather more than a cottage. It has a certain style, as I've called it there, isn't it? Entirely different to some of the others. Built probably a little bit later, and we hark back to that painting where one minute it may have been there and the next minute it had been built. A bit hard to say, about the 1840s maybe. But at the time of the willow trade in particular, it was the home of William Pizzey, and he's credited as having established the trade in the village. He brought the materials down from London. He trained people in the village. And Piggott's trade directory is always extremely useful. They listed him as being there as a willow bonnet maker. The 1881 census, change of occupant, it was Charles Smith. He was a farmer, maltster and organist, but there was still a willow manufacturer, Richard Reed, and I guess one of Michael's ancestors was still a willow manufacturer living on the Green in 1881. But by then the trade was beginning to die. The Blue Boar, I gave an extensive talk about all the pubs that have ever been in the village a few years ago, so I'm not going to dwell too much on the Blue Boar tonight. We believe it was established in the 1300s, possibly where the masons, travelling itinerant masons, came and stayed before the church was being built. The badge refers to the Earls of Oxford, particularly the Wars of the Roses, Battle of Bosworth, 1485. And it was reputedly open 1516 when the current tenor bell was upended, filled with ale prior to being hung in the church. So they knew how to do things in those days. It's rarely mentioned in the newspapers, the sort of 1800s and earlier. It's so small that there were very few gatherings. I mean, this is the original tiny bar, and so it didn't favour social gatherings. And it did close, possibly briefly, as a pub, as you might say, just after World War I. But it still catered for bed and breakfast because touring in your car, people who could afford a car in the 1920s, was very popular. So people would stay, drop in there, and you could have your car serviced as well. I noticed one of the adverts for it. And it's still an archetypal example of a country pub. Hope it stays that way. And of course, in the Second World War in particular, it was used by the officers of the United States 101st Airborne when they were training in the village. And now it's very important as a sort of place of pilgrimage almost by the American tours. When they come round, we take people in there and show them where the officers drank associated with the Band of Brothers. One of the few internal shots we've got back in the 1970s. You can tell by the style of dress. I'm sure one or two of you had the flared trousers in those days. I certainly did. The bar's in a different position, but same boar's head is still up there as there is today. It must be very old, it was that boar. And also very famous as being, in other words, the Cloven Hoof, when it was renamed for the 1971 Doctor Who series, Doctor Who and the Demons, which was filmed in the village and shown on television. And again, we get tours and groups of people coming around following the route and locations of Doctor Who series, and they love coming to Walborn to see where it was filmed. As I say, I'm not going to dwell too much on those bits and pieces. That's another view of it. It's very simple style, obviously before the restaurant was built alongside. That wasn't until the 1990s when that came. Bit of light entertainment in those days, got really exciting with a bit of Morris dancing outside. Here's something some of you might never have seen. The Blue Boar featured as a jigsaw puzzle. Michael Hare, who was the landlord there for 9 years, he produced 4 different versions of this jigsaw puzzle, something of collector's items now. We've certainly got them at home, and a delightful thing. Not many places will have their pub featured as a jigsaw puzzle. Hightown House, there little group of people. That's Terry, I can just see in the middle there, showing some of our American visitors around, I think. And obviously we mentioned that because Hightown was the officers' mess when the 101st were training in the village, and the officers' mess was there, and the accommodation alongside. Sorry, I've jumped several hundred years. It was the site of the chantry of the Fraternity of the Blessed Virgin Mary on that site. Much later, small bell foundry briefly existed there. Thereafter, it became a farmhouse and then subsequently became the stables. And we touched on that earlier on. This is back to that photograph of when there were stables established all around here. High-class training stables. The original stables having been destroyed in 1921. That was probably about the last time Adam and Eve were used for fighting significant fire. But Major Powell then rebuilt the stables 1924, and it became a very successful race training site right through to the 50s. And the stables were used as billets by some of the servicemen, most notably the Americans, but others did use it during that time, during the wartime. And Hightown House, as I say, was the officers' mess. And the last two remaining, for those not familiar with the story, the last two remaining stables were regarded as so important that they were taken apart piece by piece and transferred across to the 101st Airborne Museum in Toccoa in Georgia. Stephen Sowerby and his father were instrumental in making sure that they were retained, and they're very important to the Americans. You'll be pleased to know we're nearly there. Number 23, obviously another very old property. This most notable thing is its link to the fustian trade. Fustian was this tough material, much favoured by rich people in the 15 and 1600s. By the 1800s, it was becoming more of a workaday material, very tough, a bit like moleskin, that sort of thing, and it was worn by country people. And fustian production in the village was extremely important. Edward Witts occupied that premises around about the 1680s. And when he died, he left fustian pieces, not made into clothes at that point, but in pieces, to the value of £17,000 by today's values. So very important. And he left it in his calendar house. That's a set of rollers that's used to sort of press material flat, make it easier to work with and make into clothes, I believe. And his son Benjamin was left that, and the business continued to flourish well into the 1800s. And the shed at the back, Jill Reeve lives, Jill's here somewhere, isn't she? Jill, there, is still known as the Fustian Store, so it's got a very important history. If we jump along to the other end, the right-hand end of that property, which is quite long, that was the George Inn, a pub way back, 1700s, of sufficient size that it was important as a meeting place. The court leet, manor court, that's roughly equivalent to the sort of parish council, is recorded as meeting there, holding their meetings. And there's a remarkable set of documents again, covering a very long period, which Dave Sims and Debbie, somewhere here, over there somewhere, kindly loaned me a few years back. And again, you could talk a whole talk about that and various successive owners of that property. Interestingly, it became the George Inn. It was held by George Bond, and he came from Ogbourne, St. George. So it's quite possible the name doesn't follow the Hanoverian monarchs. It was a name was perhaps not a bit unusual, but George a little bit earlier and not named after the kings. It closed probably because the larger crown had taken over. And then it subsequently became the village post office, both for mail and telegraph activity, and it did have an external phone box at one time, painted white originally, red came along afterwards. And then, of course, the post office removed to where it is today in the village stores. And at one time, those cottages were called veranda cottages. It's not very obvious that there would have been a veranda, not as we know it outside. Doesn't seem to be enough room, but that's what it says. So you would be relieved to say, yeah, that's about right for me. That's about to conclude. And I'm sorry I couldn't, as I say, cover everything around the green, all the properties. Some I know little or nothing about. Others we know some more about, but too much for the sort of talk this evening. But I hope you found something interesting. And I must give thanks to those and the sources. There's 3 books that are quite important if you've recently moved to the village, you haven't already got them. Ida Gandhi's Heart of a Village is extremely useful. Now, it's about the only book that's ever been written in great detail, and there are 1 or 2, shall we say, misunderstandings, slight errors in it, but she spent, a lot of time research, and it's a good starting point. Followed by Maurice Crane's Aldbourne Chronicle, much thinner book, but that's a chronological list of how things developed in the village, and again, quite essential. And the Millennium book, much more recent, of course, Millennium, which is a fascinating account of virtually all the properties and the people who lived in them in the village around about the year 2000. It's a sort of doomsday book, as you might say, of the millennium, and it's still extremely useful, all sorts of snippets of information. I mentioned The Ingenious Mr. Fairchild. That's the book that was written about Thomas Fairchild, and I use the British Newspaper Archive for a lot of information. And personally, people have helped me put the talk together, and actually I appreciate that, and I'm sure I've left out 1 or 2 people. Names you may not be familiar with there. Claire Charlton and Richard Lockwood live at War Cottage. They often spend time in London, which is why they're not here this evening. I'm not sure they're watching on Zoom, but they may watch the recording later on. And they were they put in some information as well. And I suppose that's about all. You'll be pleased to know.